Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp and I am the Chief Digital Manager for Dataversity. We would like to thank you for joining today's Dataversity webinar, Data Governance Strategies. With great power comes great accountability, the latest installment in the monthly series called Data Ed Online with Dr. Peter Aiken, brought to you in partnership with Data Blueprint. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. If you'd like to chat with us or with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. Just click the chat icon in the upper right-hand corner for that feature. For questions, we will be collecting them via the Q&A in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, or if you like to tweet, we encourage you to share highlights or questions via Twitter using #DataEd. To answer the most commonly asked questions, as always, we will send a follow-up email to all registrants within 2 business days containing links to the slides, and yes, we are recording and will likewise send a link of the recording of this session, as well as any additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now let me introduce to you our speaker for today. Peter Aiken is an internationally recognized data management thought leader. Many of you know him or have seen him at conferences worldwide. He has more than 30 years of experience and has received many awards for his outstanding contributions to the profession. Peter is also a founding director of Data Blueprint. He has written dozens of articles and 8 books. The most recent is Monetizing Data Management. Peter is experienced with more than 500 data management practices in 20 countries and constantly named as a top data management expert. Some of the most important and largest organizations in the world have sought out his and Data Blueprint's expertise. Peter has spent multi-year immersions with groups as diverse as U.S. Department of Defense, Deutsche Bank, Nokia, Wells Fargo, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and Walmart. He often appears at conferences. In fact, he's currently at the Dataversity Conference, Data Governance and Information Quality in San Diego, and is constantly traveling. So let me turn everything over to Peter to get today's webinar started. Hello and welcome.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm sure the weather in Portland can't compare to San Diego, but we're having a great time here. This is the largest data governance conference we've had to date. It's 550 plus people. Just had a couple of great keynotes that got started, and everybody's looking forward to a really, really super week. So sorry you guys all can't join us here, but maybe next year we'll get around to seeing some more of you out here. I'm going to start out today with a little interesting directive. Now, you've heard a lot about executive orders from the federal level. This is our Governor Terry McAuliffe, who put out an order that said, I'll just read you the parts I'm underlining, increasing the use of shared data and analytics among Virginia agencies through a comprehensive coordinated effort will improve the provision of services and outcomes, maximize the use of resources, and increase the return on investment of our citizens' tax dollars after their governance. Of course, they're going to pay attention to privacy aspects of it, but what they really want to do with this executive order is focus on generating a common data sharing lexicon and terminology to eliminate the friction and confusion among state agencies. This is an excellent articulation, at least on the state government level, of why you need data governance. And so from a strategy perspective, that's what his staff is working on now, taking us to that next level of planning and bringing these things forward. So if you're a Virginia resident, you can feel very, very good about the process that's going on here. We'll probably be able to tell you some stories on that sometime in the near future as we talk about the Virginia Governor's Data Interns Program and how all that relates to what we're talking about. What we really want to do, though, is to talk about the sort of perception that data is kind of this bat sign in between IT and business, which is the way most people think of it. Unfortunately, it's not a really good way to think about it, and if we can change your minds through this webinar and others to understand that data has a much broader perspective. It's not just this little thing in there between IT and business, but it is the thing that IT and business both are attacking in order to help organizations achieve the mission that they are on. Let's talk specifically about data. Data is the most powerful, underutilized, poorly managed organizational data asset. It is the only asset that you have that is not depletable. It is not degrading. It is durable in nature at the strategic level. Data assets really do win when you compare them to other assets in here. I get furious when I see people say things like data is the new oil, because that is so the wrong way to think about it. Oil is a commodity, and that commodity is not something that is going to help your organization in the long run. The fuel may be good, but thinking about data as a fuel is a really poor way to think about it. I like to change it to data is the new soil, which implies 2 functions. One, you have to prepare the soil in order to actually grow good stuff in it. Hats off to all of you gardeners out there. And the other part of it is a timing issue. There is no way that you can reasonably expect to plant tomatoes on Tuesday and eat tomatoes from your new tomato plant on Thursday. It takes time to prepare, and it takes time to grow, and that really is a much better way to think about data. So data really should be thought of as the new soil. On the other hand, whatever you need to do to sell it to your organization, if you want to call it the new bacon, that's okay too. As such, though, as a unique asset, data deserves its own strategy. It deserves attention on par with similar organizational assets, and it needs professional administration to make up for past neglect. Let me give you three basic pieces of past neglect that combined represent the biggest threat to U.S. national security that we have ever faced. A target data breach took data on tens of millions of customers and sent it out to bad guys who now know things like how long it takes you to drive to work and whether you've been bankrupted in the past. The Ashley Madison breach was about 47 million customer accounts, of which several 100,000 of them were .mil, .gov type of addresses. In other words, people putting their own work addresses in at Ashley Madison. Not exactly the brightest bulbs in the garden there, if you will, to continue our gardening analogy on that. We add to that the Office of Personnel Management data breach, which was another horrible one. And now the bad guys are taking the top secret information that was in the OPM data breach, so somebody that may have a top secret clearance, for example, for the U.S. government, and showed not necessarily the most common sense by using the U.S. government email address to register for the Ashley Madison cheating website. And then they can find out specific personal habits that they might have, such as how long it takes them to drive to work. This makes these individuals highly susceptible to blackmail. And of course, we've seen some recent instances at the federal level where that has been problematic as well. None of these organizations were managing data with proper governance, and that's a real issue on this. The really interesting part about the OPM data breach in particular was that the Office of Personnel Management personnel, the people who made the decision to put that data online, were in fact unqualified to make that decision. Some data should never be put online, should be locked away in a vault so that it can be accessed later on, and maybe with a backup copy at another location. However, the door is open, the barn door is open, whatever you want to do it, and now we are scrambling to recover from that particular instance. As for Target, Beth Jacobs, who was the CIO, resigned abruptly. The Target CEO also was fired as a result, and they came after the shareholders eventually. The shareholders came after the board of directors, which leads us all to understand that these decisions do have very severe consequences. So people are becoming more aware, and I think, again, the outstanding attendance we have at this conference now is evidence that more and more people are paying attention to what's going on in this area. Data governance is critically important because it costs organizations millions of dollars each year in productivity. Your organization is probably facing redundant and siloed efforts, poorly thought out hardware and software purchases, delayed decision-making using inadequate information. It means that your organization is being reactive instead of proactive. And gosh, if you have none of those things in your organization or problems, you can still save 20 to 40% of your IT spend on that. And that is just an absolutely astounding amount of money that organizations are simply pouring down the drain. Not a really good way to do it. Our DEMA-DIMBOK governance shows us that governance is the heart of everything that's happening in the data management space. It is surrounded by all the other activities that we have. And each of the DIMBOK activities does give us a slide that allows you to do this. This is really reference material, and a lot of the material I have in this deck for you will be reference material as well, so that you can use it for future planning. But the goal here of this IPO diagram, input-output diagram, is to show that we have some inputs, we have some activities, and we have some outputs. I won't read them all to you. You guys can do that at your leisure. What we're going to talk about is how to weave all of these things together from a strategic perspective. So we're going to talk a little bit about what strategy is and how the content of strategy really needs to be thought differently in organizations, because it does put them in a place where they need to make some difficult choices. We'll get into data governance. What is it? Why is it important? and what are the requirements that one needs to have in order to make data governance effective in your organization. Then we'll look at some very specific components, meaning frameworks, building blocks, checklists, and let's go ahead and talk about some worst practices in here. Then we'll get to some storytelling, which is one of the major aspects of data governance. You have to communicate. I'm always amused when I see organizations where they say, well, I told everybody, and that was enough. Our rule of thumb, of course, is that you have to tell people things 7 times before they start to really get what you're talking about. Then we'll finish up with some takeaways, and as always, looking forward to the Q&A at the end of the session here. So let's dive in specifically and talk about how data governance and data strategy relate to each other. Data strategy, and Jenna, we're back up to 10 books now. So the data strategy book came out. It was delivered here to the conference. I've managed to hand a couple copies to people, and hopefully people can go download that from Amazon as well. Anyway, data governance and data strategy. Data strategy is about what the data assets do to support your organizational strategy, and data governance is then how well is that data strategy working. We're going to put that in the context so that everybody understands that we subordinate, of course, data strategy to organizational strategy. So your data governance efforts are aimed at implementing the data strategy for the organization. Those of you that have heard me speak on this before know that I believe that data governance really is superior to IT projects, and that the data is delivered by IT to the business. That's critically important because most of the time, as you'll see a little bit later on, we've been doing that exactly backwards. I'll finish this diagram out with a couple little feedback loops. And I wouldn't bother to show this to management because even that may be confusing for them. So let's make that diagram a little bit simpler. Again, data strategy is what the data assets do to support strategy, and that should be expressed in specific business goals. The data governance is about achieving business objectives. Then the feedback from data governance is how well is the data strategy working, and the language of data governance is metadata. So let's talk a little bit about strategy. One of the best talks out there in the vast library of TED Talks is Simon Sinek's talk on how great leaders inspire action. And he's pretty straightforward with it. He starts out and says, we're pretty good at describing what we do. We're less good at describing how we do it. And we're not very good at describing why we do things. If you can imagine, just take one example that he gives in the talk, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King saying, I have a plan. He didn't say that. He said, I have a dream, which is the difference between what and why, and a very powerful example of that. Strategy, then, is typically derived from military usage, but it does represent a pattern in a stream of decisions. My favorite definition of strategy. I see strategy documents that are 100 pages. There's no way that anybody can absorb that much material correctly and try to implement it. Let's take a look at 2 quick examples of strategy and how it works. Again, pattern in a stream of decisions. We're back in Napoleon's time where he's facing 2 armies, and his strategy was very simple: divide and conquer. And I should mention also the 2 armies that he's facing. So Napoleon is here on the diagram in blue, and those are the French. The British are in red in the upper left side, and the mid-right side are the Prussians. So you can see they're fighting in the middle of Belgium. And one of the things that Napoleon noticed was that an army, when it's hit and has to retreat, will retreat away, towards its food as opposed to away from its food. And if you think about it, that's a reasonably natural proposition for any group of individuals, much less an army. So the British supply was through Ostend. You can see it up there in the upper left-hand corner, whereas the Prussians were in Liege. So Napoleon said, okay, our process of dividing and conquer then applies as following. Remember, he's training this to troops who are, good at what they do, but it's in the heat of battle, so you've got to give them a set of guidance that allows them to, in this case, see the pattern in the stream of decisions that everybody's going through. So we're going to hit them, and when we hit them, you'll notice he's trying to hit them in the middle so that they will split apart, retreating, of course, towards their own supply lines. Then once he's hit them, we then have to say, first, troops, take out the Prussians, and secondly, after we've taken out the Prussians, take out the British. Notice if there's any confusion on that. If half the troops go after the British and the other half go after the Prussians, that strategy will not work. If he doesn't hit them in the right place, that strategy will not work. So the divide and conquer is a highly cited example of really brilliant military strategy. Of course, the only problem was this was Waterloo, and that didn't end up working out so well for him. Second definition of strategy here, again, very simple as well. Wayne Gretzky didn't say, I'm going to chase the puck around the rink. He says, I'm skating to where I think the puck will be. That allows us then to anticipate what moves are and be prepared to proactively stay on top of the game. And of course, everybody knows how well Wayne Gretzky's strategy worked. Very, very well. So let's shift now to corporate governance, because governance is about ensuring strategy that happens. And again, I'm not going to read through this, but there's not an organization in the world that doesn't have some forms of corporate governance in there. And, well, of course, we have corporate governance. We then need to move to IT governance. Again, very, very reasonable in order to do this. The real challenge, however, is that the link between IT and the business has not been well established. There are very few methods that organizations use in order to connect these two. We've gone into many, many organizations where we will look, and I have to acknowledge my colleague Don Ladley for this particular diagram, but it's a wonderful illustration of it, where somebody says, hey, you know, here's our corporate goals, and here's our IT. And there really is a big problem, because the gap from going from corporate to IT is a big gap in most organizations. They just have a lot of trouble. And the reason for that is because we've traditionally taught that there's an organizational strategy, an IT strategy, and a data strategy should be subordinate to that particular piece. This is so wrong. Again, this is us learning. It's okay. What really should be happening here is that the organizational strategy should be developed first, and then in conjunction, an IT and a separate data strategy should be developed. And there should be a precedent in this case. The data strategy should be developed before the IT strategy, so that there is a way of actually working with this. Now, I'm going to give you the first piece of supplemental piece on this. There's some very nice strategic data elements in here that come from the CMMI Institute. Maybe you've heard us do the seminars with Melanie occasionally, and Melanie Necker, she's a wonderful person to work with. And we've been able to do some really good things. I'm not going to go over this, but it's something you can take away with you. So strategy allows us then to make some choices, but even more difficult in our choices is that you're now starting to get into who moved my cheese, or sacred rice bowls, or whatever it is you want to think of. You're upsetting the apple cart when you come in and say, no, 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 the data strategy is actually more important than the IT strategy. Boy, that does not make me a lot of friends. I still believe it's correct, and I believe a lot of people agree with me on that. So I'm going to do a quick little Dilbert here also to show you something to stay away from the data governance perspective. Again, sort of a negative example, but Dilbert's examples almost always come from the real world. I should say Scott Adams, not Dilbert, but he's not the same person. Anyway, Ted here, who's in the meeting, says, the committee decided that the file naming convention will start with the date in the order of month, year, and day. Now, right away, he's made a mistake, because, of course, it should be year, month, and day, so that we can sort them in the right order and find things on that. He's continuing, though. Then we put a space in the file name, then the temperature at the airport, the hat size of the nearest squirrel. And to be perfectly honest, he says it was a long meeting. We probably didn't do our best work. That's the kind of thing you want to avoid. Also, here are 7 data governance definitions. I'm not going to read them for you. You can go out and find them on the web. In there, even our DIMBOK has the exercise and authority over management of data assets. These are really good definitions, in my opinion. My favorite definition of data governance is managing data with guidance. If you understand that, then you can ask people, would you want your soul non-depletable, non-degrading, durable strategic asset managed without guidance? And most people will say, oh gosh, no, I don't think so. So it's important to find out what's going to work for your organization. What does data governance mean to our organization at this point in time? Typically, it comes down to managing data with guidance, but also getting some individuals whose opinions matter to form a body that will advocate for increasing the scope and rigor of data-centric practices. It is so important to put your data governance in the language that your organization understands. And I'm going to give you a very specific example. This was a group that we worked with a couple of years back. One of the things they would tell us as we were talking to them about their desires to use data was that they said, you know, getting data around here is like that Catherine Zeta-Jones scene where she was having to go through all those lasers. It was a kind of a cool movie about her and Sean Connery were robbers of some sort. But this is how they understood their process of getting data was. And of course, you can get good at this. It's not really what you want to pay your people to do, though, is it? So keep that in mind, that data governance has got to be personalized down to the process of being able to really understand what is going to make a difference for your organization at the point in time they are currently at, and maybe looking a little bit further into the head. Let's talk for just a minute then, because there is some confusion between what is the difference between data governance and data management. Governance is policy-level guidance, setting general directions and guidelines, just the same as Napoleon says, first of all, hit them in the middle at this right spot and hit them really hard so they'll go backwards. And then secondly, go after the Prussians, and then thirdly, go after the British. Well, that's governance. Data management then is the business function of planning, controlling, and delivering information and data assets. Again, solving specific problems that they're doing. Now, again, these next couple slides are kind of supplemental. I'm not going to read them to you, but this is sort of the general guidance that you get from Dimbach and other sources that say, what should I include in my data governance program? There should be some goals and principles. There should be some deliverables. There should be some roles and responsibilities. There should be some practices and techniques, right? Well, I'm just going to put all of those up onto one page here just to put it in place. And let me give you a probably better way to do it. Yes, these things will eventually come into play. However, if you start with them, it's going to look like a big effort. Many people ask, oh my gosh, how long is that data project going to go on? And the answer is, your data governance program should continue as long as you have an HR program. After all, nobody in today's world would say, oh, I think we're done with the HR project. It's over, we're good, you know, everything's cool. That's exactly the same level of support you should have within your data governance effort. So data governance is saying, if I use my data, my organizational data, to support strategy, how can I do it in a way that makes the most difference right now? And then we'll get better at goals and principles, deliverables, roles and responsibilities, practices and techniques. In fact, let me give you one more example. This is my colleague David Plotkin's wonderful book on data stewards, where he lists out a bunch of different data steward types: business stewards, technical stewards, project data steward, domain stewards, operational stewards, metadata stewards, data quality. Do I have that on the twice? No, just once, okay. And yet, when it comes down to it, can you imagine trying to explain everybody the difference between each of these bits and pieces? So my guidance here is this is probably a stage 2 type of process for organizations to look at. The most important thing from a governance perspective is to put somebody in place that is responsible for managing the data as an asset for the organization. The best analogy of this, I was a Boy Scout at one point in my life, and they would tell us when we went into the woods, leave nothing but trash because, I'm sorry, leave nothing but footprints. Wow, boy, that was a slip. Leave nothing but footprints in the forest, and you are responsible. You need to be a good steward of the land. So to make sure that we can come back and continue to camp and do the other things that we do in Boy Scouts around that. So the goal here is not to start out with a large and complicated plan, but instead to start simple. Work your way into this. If you start out here and you have even 3 types of data stewards, I still consider that to be way overkill. One thing, just call people stewards. get people used to the idea that somebody is going to be caring for data as an organizational resource. And from that perspective, then look at, well, in phase 2, we'll then start to differentiate the types of data stewards, business stewards, technical stewards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let's move on a little further into the component parts of this. And I like to call this making a better data governance sandwich. Most organizations have varying, lumpy levels of data literacy. Some people in the organization are more literate than others. Some parts of the organization are better at dealing with data than the others. It would make a whole lot of sense if the organization got together periodically and said, how can we smooth out that literacy across everything? Similarly, the organizational data supplies are also varied in nature, and the use of standards within the organization is also varied. Given these 3 pieces, it's going to make a sandwich that is not very digestible. So we'd like to smooth out these levels, work on applying standards within the data supply and getting the data literacy of people up to a higher level so that we can make these things into better data sandwiches. However, the problem is this cannot happen without skill sets that are not taught in business school. So you have to go out and learn a little bit about engineering and architecture. And the reason for that actually was a sign that I saw on a tea farm in India this summer. It said, quality engineering and architecture work products do not happen by accident. That's, I know, not really insight for a lot of people, but it was wonderful to see this on a tea farm in India, and it's a pretty profound statement. So we can't take governance unless we are willing to understand the needs for engineering and architecture, and that these things will not happen by accident, but in fact have to happen intentionally. Speaking of intentionally, there's a great way of thinking about getting started on the process. On the left-hand side of the diagram, without the red lines, is a map that you can use to sort of see what's going on. You need to find out where your organization is, define a roadmap that meets that expectation, and then secure an executive mandate, and then assign some stewards. It's not just as simple as assigning stewards, but the left-hand side of the diagram occurs once. It is a necessary but insufficient prerequisite. On the right-hand side, though, once you're up and started, then you can start executing on the plan, evaluating the results, revising the plan, applying change management, and lather, rinse, and repeat, which is the phrase I've heard in the first 2 days of this conference at least 10 different times from different speakers. Seems to be the wonderful way to describe this at this point. An interesting set analogy that is used is that when I built a barn for my house, the bank gave me exactly this much money, enough money to build the foundation. Because the bank understood that if I had a poor foundation for my barn, I would spend money in vet bills that would normally be going to pay off the bank loan. In other words, the bank said, you do the foundation, and then you stop. We'll inspect the foundation, and only when you pass the foundation inspection will we then give you the next phase of the money required to build your barn. There is no IT equivalent. This is one of the first things that people in data governance have to realize, is that you're going to be fighting against your IT shop who think they do things well, but in reality have been taught incorrectly by the college and university system that serves us all. Data governance frameworks. Let's just talk about what a framework is first of all. A framework is a system of ideas that allow you to organize things and set priorities around it. It's an architectural concept that we've already talked about. It also can be used to assess the progress. For example, in my barn, don't put up the walls until the foundation has passed inspection, but once you put up the walls, put on the roof as soon as possible so you can work inside when it's raining. All dependent on continued funding in order to get this. So here are a number of frameworks in data governance. I'm going to show them to you. These are not for you to use as yours. However, by looking at a number of different ones, here's one from Gwen Thomas, the Data Governance Institute. Here is another from Rob Seiner's Non-Invasive Data Governance, and very popular. He's got a great book out on that topic. IBM has a couple of different ones that they use in order to look at this. Baseline Consulting has a very interesting target on this. The American College of Personnel Managers has, believe it or not, a data governance framework. NASCIO, which is the National Association of State CIOs, has this. I'm going to stop here for a minute. I'll show you the rest. There's also several others, checklists and things like that. I'll come back to that in just a minute. The real key with those frameworks, however, is to understand that none of these are correct for you, but it sure beats the heck out of starting off with a blank page. So no, there's nothing wrong with your set. I turned the machine off for a quick second. I'll turn it back on there so you can see it. So look at these frameworks and say, what do I like about them and what do I not like? What will work here? What will not work here? Very important to do that because, first of all, as I said before, if you just start from the very blank and say, oh, I'm going to start this off from the very beginning and we'll do it from scratch, it almost never works well on this. But if you look at several different competing models and say, what do I like from this and what do I not like from this, now you can start to put in place a framework that will help your organization understand the context in which you are trying to govern data. I mentioned before there were several checklists that I've included in here as well. This is an implementation process from NASCIO. Here's a set of checklists from, in this case, Angela Guess, who did a real nice version of it. Here's one from the federal government, Department of Education, around that. Again, a scorecard for how you do this sort of thing. Here is a set of techniques and practices. Again, I'm not reading these things because I don't want you to sit down and say, oh, okay, Peter says you need to do data evaluation, data management costs. I want you to look at these things as you're thinking about how this will work for your organization. Because again, the goal of this is to try and put in place some high-level guidance, right, a pattern in a stream of, to result in a pattern in a stream of decisions in your organization. So when people are thinking about data problems, whether they're coming at it from a regulatory perspective or from an innovation perspective, they are able then to say, I should do it this way because that is what our strategy involves. And governance is then all around this idea. Here again, same thing, a list of governance activities. Well, goodness gracious, we don't want you to get good at these all the way because nobody can do that. It's kind of like saying, okay, I want you to learn how to ski, so go up to the XX trails right away and let me know how it works out for you. Heck, you'll probably be, well, let's just say there'll be some interesting lessons along the way. Again, policies, standards, issues, all of these things are important, but the key is to find out what is going to help your organization most at this point in time. One last piece of this. We do a fair amount of work with various vendors, and most of the technologies are very, very good, but you can start your data governance initiatives with just simple tools that already exist in your organization. Again, what we're looking to avoid here is an illustration on this next piece. So in the bottom right-hand corner, imagine the Hotel California playing in the background. Sing these lyrics to yourself, right? This also shows you that somebody had too much time out of data governance and needs you to kind of get this together. Which I think the origin of it is actually quite clever. Punchline coming up. If people are thinking at that point in time about why am I in this meeting, then you know you have not done the work correctly. So John Ladley yesterday gave a great talk about the difference between buy-in and commitment. Yeah, it's okay for everybody to say, it sounds like a good idea to me, versus actually hiring somebody that's in charge of it and making sure that they're on the line in order to deliver results. Many organizations try to jump the gun. They do a ready, fire, aim as opposed to a ready, aim, fire. They try to solve world hunger or boil the ocean. We're going to get all of our data top quality really soon, right? Well, good luck with that one. Don't want to compromise too much. Some things are not compromisable. So you don't want to say too much or too little. You don't want to try to get it just right, but you want to do, in fact, make the organization work. Committee overload, of course, is one of the things they're talking about in that little jokey thing about the Hotel California. A lot of organizations do great planning and are terrible at implementation because this stuff is hard. It can be fun, but it is absolutely very hard. There is an aspect of change management to every aspect of what we're doing here, but more so in data governance because we are talking about very significant changes in order to do this. Technology, of course, by itself is not the answer to everybody's problems. Technology is an appropriate part. Remember, think of it in threes: people, process, and technology, not just technology alone. It is critical to build so that you can sustain this effort in the long run. And finally, you've got to have an idea of where the rest of the data is in your organization. Most people call this a data inventory. I have never met an organization in 33 years that had a complete data inventory except for one, and that was the U.S. Marine Corps. So let's move on a little bit now. Again, what we've talked about is what is governance and what are the requirements for it, what are the frameworks, the building blocks, and checklists, work practices. Let's talk specifically now here about a couple of stories because it is really critical to be able to tell stories around the process of data governance. And one of the things that I learned early in my career, the Department of Defense sent me up to Detroit, Michigan, and their mission was go look at how they're doing best practices so the government can learn from these best practices. Now, one of the things we observed in Detroit was that if Detroit was doing a manufacturing of car engines, and actually cars all the way around, what they would do is set a criteria that you could attach something to the engine if it didn't slow down the production line. So you might have the chassis of the car and the engine of the car attached, and then you need to attach an oil filter, an air conditioning piece, an electrical generator. And these things had to be added to the assembly line, but they couldn't slow the assembly line down. That was considered successful, which meant the way in which you attached these things to the engine was not paid attention to. You might have 10 different bolts, which meant that you had 10 different wrenches, which means that all of your people that were maintaining the systems had to have 10 different types of bolt and wrench inventories in order to keep this in place. This is generally not a good thing. And we also contrasted this. David Halberstam had a wonderful book out at the time that I read, where they do another step in Toyota, and they would come back and look at the car after they built it a couple times and say, now, not standardize on one bolt, which would leave you an ideal situation of one bolt and one wrench and one inventory, but instead see how many of them can be standardized. And this is key. Most organizational data governance things tend to try and say we've got to use absolutely all standards all the time. No, your job as data governance specialists is to find out how much you should standardize and then make those recommendations appropriately. If you don't, you'll end up with trying to attach something with the wrong size bolt, and it won't work later on when the car goes into production. Here's another quick little story about choices, and I mentioned some hard choices in the last little section on this as well. When you're doing governance, it makes sense to be guided by strategy. After all, if you don't know which road where you're going, any road will take you there, right? So from a strategy perspective, there really are only two dimensions. You can make things more efficient and effective, or you can innovate. If you are looking for something else, there isn't, right? We've done all kinds of research, and these are the two ways in which strategy is implemented: innovations and improve operations. Now, most organizations aren't thinking about their data as a strategic asset, so if your organization is, consider yourself fortunate that you're working for an enlightened company that really does value what it is that you do. Most organizations would then say, both increase efficiency and effectiveness, and everybody would agree that Walmart is a great model for increasing efficiencies and effectiveness. Those people are really, really good at what they do there. Similarly, many people would claim that Apple is an innovative company. The key here, though, is don't try to do both of these at once. Because what happens is, if you take the people at Apple who are really good at innovation and effectiveness, think of somebody like Johnny Ive, who's a very popular figure in the Apple design community. If you told Johnny Ive to be efficient and effective, he's a brilliant guy, he could do it, but most of the rest of the designers there would have a lot of trouble with that. Same thing if you went to Walmart, took the people who are really good at efficiencies and effectiveness and said, you guys now be innovative, it just doesn't happen. So what I get is most organizations say, oh, good, we want to do all of this at once. If instead you build your governance practice around moving from quadrant 1 to quadrant 2, by increasing the organizational efficiencies and effectiveness, you will also save yourself some money. And you can then invest that money into the innovation component of it in order to do it a much more planned and effective fashion. Only 1 in 10 organizations actually have a board-approved data strategy. Consequently, you're in pretty good shape. If you start to do this, you're ahead of the pack. Let's look at another aspect of this that's done very difficultly. And again, these charts I'm giving you with the hope that they'll be helpful to you all explaining this to the organization. So many organizations follow what seems to be a very reasonable path. I've got a strategy. The organizations implement some IT projects. And data and information are typically considered within the scope of the IT projects. The problems with this approach, though, are that it ensures the data is formed around the applications and not around the organization-wide information requirements. But the process architecture that's developed is narrowly formed around the applications, and very little data reuse is possible in this context. The problem is, if you just look at the right-hand side of the diagram, strategy, IT, and then data seems a very natural way to go. Again, it is wrong. Evolving data is so different than creating IT systems. It operates at a different cadence, a different rhythm. Data evolves, let's just say it that way. Data evolves over time, and it evolves slowly. That's the nature of evolution. If you look back in your own organization, you could probably point to using the same data elements 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and that the basics of the data aspect of your business have not changed. They operate at a different cadence or rhythm, and therefore, in order to make it work correctly, you need to separate it from, make it external to, and precede systems development lifecycle activities. So our revised model is very similar to the other one. In support of strategy, the organization develops, in this case, not IT goals, but shared data-based goals. And those data-based goals then drive IT projects. So all I've done is I've flipped data and information and IT projects. These then allow us to develop the organizational data assets from a broad perspective, across organizational perspective, and that the systems that support these data needs now can be organized to complement the organizational process flows. And finally, we can get to the point of saying we're simply going to use this in a way that maximizes our information reuse. Another story here, this is an organization that sells lots and lots of chocolate, and they went through a process of trying to do some change around the same time they were trying to sell lots of chocolate. We could figure out that's the holidays, right? Well, the data governance organization did not step up and say, I'm not sure we should be changing this much data at the time we're trying to sell lots and lots of chocolate. And this chocolate story became a part of the organizational culture and lore, so that I can sit down with this company even 10 years after the original incident, and we'll start talking about things, and somebody at the table will go, oh, is this that chocolate story you're always telling us, Peter? Yeah, this is the chocolate story. So governance has a key role to play in a lot of these organizations. By the way, I'm telling you these stories not so that they will apply to you, but in hopes that you'll be similarly inspired to share your stories with your organization so that you can help make this very, very powerful argument for why this is such an important topic. Another example here, healthcare.gov, most people are pretty familiar with that. It was one of those big oopsies, but Obamacare is back in the marketplace now, and so we're talking about it again. Just from a governance perspective, there were 55 contractors, not people, but contracting organizations chasing $500 million that they spent to build this website. First thing was 6 weeks from the launch, the requirements hadn't been finalized. Well, a data governance initiative that said that we will allow IT projects to go forward only when the requirements are finalized, when we understand the data requirements and how they're going to be used, would never have let this project continue down the road. They should have delayed the launch. It was real clear. And Jim Johnson, who's the chair of Standish Group, actually said, you know, the amazing thing would have been that if it had actually worked, because I don't know about you guys, but if you're working on a system and you haven't got the requirements finalized by 6 weeks from launch, I don't think the prognosis is very good. But let me give another data governance piece of this specific example. Again, when the company that was, well, there were 55 companies, when one of the companies that was programming it was programming using traditional data access technologies, SQL in this case. But another company that was on the receiving end of that was actually implementing things using big data technologies. Now, this is NoSQL and lots of other types of things. And of course, the two don't work. It's like asking you know, a person to take on something that they have never been trained in order to do. It was a perfect example of where data governance would have absolutely prevented this particular public relations disaster that may have had a profound impact on the way our country treats its citizens in the long run. We were very fortunate to do 2 projects with the Army recently, and we've done a lot of them, of course. But one of the first ones was that we went into the Army. They asked us to help develop some data governance guidance for them. The really interesting thing about this is that in the Army, the culture is that everything is governed. So I don't want to say this was the easiest data governance, but it was certainly the easiest case we've ever made to data governance. Because when the Army found out something was not governed, they went, oh my goodness, we have to fix that. So we were able to leverage their existing culture and work on it. Made it a very, very easy case to actually put in place. We happened to be there for the military suicide mitigation project, and I tell this story because it's an absolute data governance success story, because we were able to, sorry, I went too fast. We were able to actually solve a specific problem using governance here. So let me give you the scenario. We're trying to draw in data on military suicides from a number of different sources. I had a group that I called my Council of Colonels, and these colonels were very good people who sat in the room and said, sir, you can use my data for this purpose, and somebody else would say, you can use my data for that purpose. And I was creating an N-by-N matrix, trying to make sure I could achieve the goal in mind in this case. However, I did have one person that I could ask for their support. It was a senior official in the Army who came in and put his portfolio down on the desk when the third colonel said, sir, you can use my data in this fashion, and said, ladies and gentlemen, I have an announcement to make. From now on, we're going to refer to all of this as my data. And by saying that, the individual let everybody understand that the team was empowered to really solve the problem. The conversation was no longer about, can this be done, but how are we going to accomplish it? Because when you're told by the Secretary of the Army that if you have a question as to whether my data should save my troops' lives, and if you can't figure out how to make that work, you can make an appointment and come tell me about it, there's nobody that's going to take the Secretary of the Army up on that particular piece. Now, the reason, and by the way, the gentleman told me I could put this in the Monetizing Data Management book, which I did in there for a specific reason, and that is that he was hoping to inspire others to make similar courageous decisions. I can tell you guys that I have told this story to more than 100 different organizational CEOs, and not a one of them will take the step that the Secretary of the Army took. They say, oh, we don't work that way here. Oh, it's really, you know, it really is accounting data. That's a funny one. So again, big challenges in that area as far as how we're going to work on that. Once we did that, getting the communication patterns were very swift. Here's another interesting story on governance. Had an organization that was building a finance system, and when they bought the finance system, what they were doing, it's obviously a petrol company, they were selling petroleum products. This accounting system took every movement of product from one tank to another and counted it as a sale. Well, the problem with that is that that was not a sale, that was not a sale, that was not a sale, and even that was not a sale in many instances. And so consequently, they had a choice of either modifying their accounting software package or changing their vocabulary. And they decided through the Data Governance Initiative to change their vocabulary. it makes a difference when you're talking about that tank versus that tank. When you buy a tank, by the way, it actually results in 3 million different data values. And those data values, only one of which controls the obsolescence of the material. So we were able to help this particular service to the tune of $5 billion of inventory that now had to tie back and forth. Another quick story. Many of you remember when Lehman Brothers went under just before the last major recession that we had. There were contracts that they weren't going to buy. And what they did is they put them in a spreadsheet. And when they decided they weren't going to buy something, they hid that line of the spreadsheet. So row hide, and the thing would go away. The problem with hiding it was, though, they handed that to a first-year associate at the end of the day who reformatted the spreadsheet. And when they did that long after hours, late at night, all of those contracts came back out because he accidentally unhid all of the contracts. You better believe that at Barclays now, they have extraordinarily data governance around the use of spreadsheets because they almost ended up killing the company because of this particular spreadsheet-based era. Mizuho Securities, again, another very interesting company. Even 10 years afterwards, they were chagrined that people still remember this data governance example. They had a trader who wanted to sell one share of a company called JCOM for 600,000 yen, but it was a tough day, and he sold 600,000 shares for 1 yen, resulting in a $350 million loss. But here was the governance piece. The in-house system did not have limit checking. As data governance, it was perfectly appropriate for the data governance group to say, we don't sell penny stocks or yen stocks, and therefore anything that goes out of here with a price of 1 yen, we should flag it. Well, they didn't. Neither did the Tokyo Stock Exchange have a system for checking the limits or canceling orders, all of which should have been perfectly reasonable to look at, given what was going on in the organization. Now, the reason I'm telling you these stories is to inspire your groups to find something practical, meaningful, and in most cases, putting a dollar value on to management. Because if you don't have the ability to articulate what it is we're doing from a data governance perspective, there is no way that you will ever be able to sustain your data governance efforts. Again, most organizations, they sort of think of this as a project and say, when are you going to be done with that data governance stuff? Remember the line, when we no longer need an HR program, we will be done with the data governance program. So let's sort of start to wrap things up here a little bit and look at this from Maslow's hierarchy of needs perspective. Most people remember from high school, for some reason, I guess the Maslow portion of course actually worked really well and made sense to people. We start out at the bottom with physiological needs. If our food, clothing, and shelter needs are unmet, then we will never be safe. In other words, physiological needs being met is a necessary but insufficient prerequisite to being safe. Being safe, then, is a necessary prerequisite to actually experiencing love, family, intimacy. Again, necessary but insufficient. If you don't have love in your life, you will never have self-esteem. And self-esteem is critical, again, as a necessary but insufficient prerequisite to organizational self-actualization and personal self-actualization as well. Our data stuff is an awful lot like that. And as data governance professionals, you're going to have to do a similar type of explanation to people, which is actually less complicated but still very, very meaningful in the process. I've been using this chart for more than 30 years, and the only thing I changed are the advanced data management practices in the center. Instead of MDM, it might have actually inserted databases in the previous context on this. This is the self-actualization portion of data, and it's the part that everybody wants to do because it's the cool stuff. McKinsey and Company have put out in 2010, have put out a study that says we need to have 1.5 million people with data skills to be able to do these things in our organizations going forward. And just this year, they published an advanced version of this that says the number is now doubled to 3 million people. Well, we're not catching up. And relying on these nice-to-haves is not going to produce what we need, because the top of the pyramid is really all about advanced practices, whereas the bottom of the pyramid is about the foundation, just the same as my barn. The foundational practices are governance, quality, strategy, operations, platform, and architecture. And as I mentioned before, you do a foundation inspection in order to make sure that your things that you build on top of that foundation will hold up given the business guidance that you're trying to put them in place. Most organizations don't have a concept of this, and consequently it's very, very difficult to actually come up with specifics around how this is going to work. So again, key here is you've got to have a good quality foundation on which to build these advanced data practices, because they are largely technology focused. And we've already said it, people, process, and technology is the essence of a good, stable business solution. And these foundational practices are capabilities. So one of the things you will have to do in your governance initiative is to try and make sure that everybody understands you can't do this simply by buying technology. You've got to work the people and the process sides of this into it as well, or you will not fail. Excuse me, you will not succeed. What happens here is that we get calls all the time at Data Blueprint where people say, well, I got the pyramid thing, you know, and I understand this, but gosh, I really want to do it by Friday. And the answer is, well, you can do it faster, but if you do it faster, it will take longer, it will cost more, it will deliver less, and it will present greater risk to the organization than instead if you learn to crawl, walk, and run your way to the top of that pyramid. So let's look at a couple of quick takeaways. The need for data governance is increasing. There's a wonderful saying that our colleague Micheline Casey popularized a couple years ago, which is that you could win a lot of data arguments by saying there will never be any less data than right now. And if you wait 10 minutes and say it again, it will still be true. We don't have good practices in place. I've got several examples that I showed in this particular webinar where organizations have looked around in their organization and found out that there are pockets of data management practice excellence and data governance practice excellence in the organizations. So rather than going out and hiring people, several of the talks here are talking about how people looked around in their own organizations and leveraged the specific knowledge, skills, and abilities that their colleagues had in order to help the organization as a whole improve their practices. Data governance is a relatively new discipline. It is immature. It is not okay for us to remain immature. And when I say immature, let's just take a gander at it, right? Data management as a topic has probably been around for about 30 years. Excuse me, I said data management. Data governance has probably been a topic around for about 30 years. When we look at the accounting profession, it's been around for 8,000 years. So yeah, it's okay for us to be currently immature. It's not okay for us to stay immature. Because it's a new discipline and because it is organization-specific in its implementation, you need to conform to the constraints of your organization and know that just because company X did it that way, that might have worked for them, but that will not necessarily work for you. It's got to be driven by a data strategy that complements your existing organizational strategy. In addition to that, it also helps to compare the various data governance frameworks that I've given you here, and it directs the management of data within the organization. We used to call it data processing. It's probably still the better word for it, but nobody likes that word anymore. Remember, of course, that the language of data governance is metadata. If you're not speaking in specific, concrete terms that mean the same thing to the business and to IT, you're going to have more communication problems. And process improvement, of course, can improve your overall practices given all of that. Got a couple books out that talk about those. Again, I'm including a lot of checklists in here for you all to take a look at. We're not going to cover each of these things in here. I've also got a series of websites and books that you can reference, as well as my new book on data strategy. We are at the top of the hour, and it's time for Q&A. So Shannon, I'll turn it back over to you.
Peter, thank you so much for another great presentation. We've got questions coming in already, but to answer the most commonly asked questions, just a reminder, I will be sending out a follow-up email by end of day Thursday to all registrants with links to the slides, links to the recording of the session, and anything else requested throughout. If you have additional questions, just feel free to submit them in the Q&A section in the bottom right-hand corner there. So Peter, to start us off, if you start building data governance program from scratch, what would you do and in what order?
That's a great question. Actually, I was sitting down with the chair of the conference today and saying, you know, we really maybe ought to do one of those, you know, step 1, step 2, step 3 kind of a thing. So I've actually been thinking about that for a bit. Usually it involves sort of trying to get the focus on awareness and making sure people understand what's going on so that there's at least a rationale for how this works. Let me go to a slide that I had on here. It is that one. And let's just talk about the basic steps. There we go. So it's important to know where you are on your journey in the data governance journey. If it's something that's brand new and the organization has never heard of, then there's a lot of education that you need to do on the left-hand side of that diagram. But key is to understand that the left-hand side of the diagram has to occur before the right-hand side. I know that's quite obvious, but I see a lot of groups that start out wanting to execute. It's kind of like going out to code before you understand the requirements for it. So find out what your organization is doing around governing data. By the way, it's just like a data architecture. Your organization is governing data. The question is, are they doing it in a way that complements the organizational strategy? And if they're not, are there ways that can be improved? Once you understand that, it makes a lot of sense to go out and look at what other organizations are doing. And again, coming to an event like this, the DIQ conference here in San Diego, or another one that we'll have in the wintertime in Delray Beach, Florida. So if you're cold in the winter, come to Delray and talk about data governance with us on that. But spending 3 or 4 days immersed in data governance activities that other organizations are doing will give you a sense of where you are relative to them. And this is one of the more important conversations that we have during the networking portions of these events, is that people are outside and they're going, wow, Bank X is not a whole lot further along than where we are. Or, wow, we're really behind. Well, the answer to those questions are going to define your next steps, which is to say you need some sort of actionable steps that you can prove to people that you've done in order to develop the roadmap. Once you've got that roadmap, then it's important to go up to management and say, hey, we aren't doing this, we ought to be. You know, I need a little bit of money in order to do it. And by the way, the money is not an expense, it's an investment. So if you invest X in data governance, then I'll be able to show you in a period of time. Again, it's a garden. You're preparing the soil and you're planting things. You don't plant tomatoes on Tuesday and expect to eat tomatoes on Thursday. It just doesn't work that way. Then you assign specific individuals and then get them started solving some of these problems. That's the reason I spent so much time today telling the stories, is because you need to have a story yourself that the organization will understand. The chocolate company that I'm talking about always understands this thing. It's part of their culture. Right? In America, at least, we understand healthcare.gov didn't work so well the first time. There's questions about whether it ever worked and whether it ever will work, but those are not questions that data is going to solve, so we won't dive into them. Anyway, hopefully that's helpful, because once you get started, then, of course, you want to get better at it. That's the right-hand side of the diagram.
We could probably have a whole webinar just on that topic. So the next, yeah, it's a question that gets asked a lot, too. So how to make a business case for data governance project to get business buy-ons?
That's a great question. And you're the person, whoever's asking it, most qualified to do that. But what you have to do is find a way in which data is impacting some aspect of business operations or preventing the organization from achieving its business operations. Let me give a very specific example. We had one organization that was implementing governance, and they couldn't come up with anything, and they had to do it really quickly. In other words, it was a budget time. There was a budget meeting on Friday, and they were going to make the decision on Friday whether or not to fund this thing. And what they said was, well, we have actually hundreds of IT workers, and those IT workers cost the company, you know, a fair amount of money each year. So would you fund this project if we could guarantee you that in 1 year we would have saved every IT worker $1? I'm sorry, 1 hour of labor? And the organization went, well, that's 1 hour times several hundred workers times, you know, however they valued the thing. I went, well, that's a pretty big number, isn't it? And they'd actually hit on something that was real important, because the organization was looking at overall improvements to productivity. Now, that's a broad-based one. That was one that we did where we didn't have a lot of time to do the investigation and find out what was actually going on there. But if we go back to the chocolate organization, here was a wonderful case where the organization was doing a really good job of selling chocolate. At the same time, however, the IT team had become kind of disconnected from the process. They didn't have a concept of locking down systems to make sure that nothing went wrong during peak season, for example. So governance was actually the group that proposed that and said, you know, last year it cost us £5 million because we didn't do this well. So the good idea came out of the data governance group and said, you know, we should probably not make too many changes as we get closer and closer to our peak season. And when it does become peak season, we should probably not make any changes. So if something goes wrong, we don't have to go back and undo patches or whatever it is that was going on in order to do that. Let me take this question a little further, though, because it's a great question. We've done a lot of work on it. Selling data governance is a little like selling other good projects. One of my favorite ones that actually my wife brought to me is that there's an organization called Noise Free America. Now, most of us would agree that if the environment was less noisy, it would be easier to do more work. For example, as I was preparing for the webinar this morning, I am literally sitting on the beach here in San Diego. I know it's awful duty and you guys cry for me. But I will tell you this, there were joggers that came by about every 5 or 10 minutes that caused me a little bit of a distraction because I was kind of concentrating pretty hard on this and trying to you know, put a lot of effort into making sure this is a good webinar for you guys. And I finally decided that I had to put on my sunglasses and turn away from the joggers so that I could really concentrate on this. Now, if those joggers were behind me throwing firecrackers around, you can imagine my job of trying to come up with this webinar would have been a lot more. If you make the country less noisy, we could expect productivity levels to come up. But that's only a secondary effect, and data works in the same way. You've got to be able to find a way in which you can say data will impact this business activity, and this business activity, if we increase it or decrease it, will help the organization in the way that conforms with organizational strategy. One of the books that I found that was most helpful for this is a book by a guy named Douglas Hubbard, who wrote a couple years back called How to Measure Anything. And that book has been a great source of inspiration on how we find the types of measurements that we need to have in order to make these data governance projects profitable. So I've got another talk that I'm working on called Data Governance for Profit, which will be taking some of those examples and putting some specific dollar values on it so that organizations will see it. Because remember, our executives are busy. And they have time, but you've got to make a concise case to them. You can't say, you know, I want 2 hours with the board of directors so I can explain to them the ins and outs of data governance. Instead, it's got to be, if we do this piece as our first bit of data governance, it will result in these business outcomes. And if the board sees you do that, they will start to think of you as an investment. They'll start to think of data governance as an investment. And they will start to change their perception on how all this works. So hopefully that's a longish answer, but I think it's a great question.
Yeah, there's a lot of great questions coming in, and questions that, you know, we see pretty regularly, so just know that you're not alone in wanting to understand this. Another question, you know, along the same lines is, you know, I won't use the word bypass, quote unquote, but I wonder how we can bring IT departments to support our cause. So I assume this person's from the business side. And how can we make them our allies to implement and institute a data governance plan for our organizations?
Super. So about half of the CIOs that I speak to are really incensed about data, and they realize they're not doing much with it, and if they had a governance group that was helping them out, first of all, it would take some of the pressure off of the CIO, who is the person who's typically responsible for these in most organizations. There is a new concept called CDO, Chief Data Officer, that's coming along. Again, about half of the CIOs say, sure, I'd like the CDO to be part of our organization because that way I would have one throat to choke. Hate to say it that way, but that's what a lot of people are thinking. One throat to choke in case something goes wrong with the data. On the other hand, Many of the CIOs look around and say, well, my title is CIO. Of course I'm in charge of this stuff, and I must be doing a good job or I wouldn't be a good CIO. Again, not necessarily in that case because we don't do a good job, haven't done a good job of educating people around that. But when organizations are faced with these kinds of challenges, it's important to help everybody to understand, and it's partly explaining. You know, I do a webinar once a month, so I hit hundreds of you guys each month with some of this type of education. But if you weren't on the webinar, you're not going to get the benefit from it. So what else can you do? You can create infographics around your organization. I make sure that all data governance groups have a mandatory internally facing website that says, these are the things we've done in data governance, and these are the results that we've gotten from our data governance efforts in there. I may have drifted a bit. Read the question again one more time, Shannon.
Yes, so I won't use the word bypass, but I wonder how we can bring IT departments to support our cause, and how can we make them our allies to implement instituted data governance plans for our organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. Very smart question. I'm sorry I lost track of it there for a quick second, but the real key was that IT tends not to know a bunch about this, and they also tend to think that because it is in their IT systems is their purview. If you can help IT to understand that what they do is really, really good and really, really valuable, and that what you can do is help them become even more perceived as being valuable to the organization, that's your best approach. So again, I'll just take an example. Somebody's putting in a new system, and they put the new system in. The software generally works. But if you take the new system and fill it full of rubbish data that has not been, in fact, properly vetted, that is of unknown provenance, that people use to make what seem to be good decisions but don't result in good business outcomes, IT bears the brunt of that disgruntlement. Well, you put in this new system, and it's terrible. It's an awful system. If, on the other hand, you can get to the IT people and say, look, together, working together, we can help to do all of this sort of stuff here, and this sort of thing will allow us to get much, much better results from our overall process. We will be able to do all sorts of things. Anyway, sorry, I had a friend pop up. Actually, our good friend Len Silverstone, most of you guys know him. See, I told you it was distracting here at the beach. Anyway, the key is to go back into IT and make sure that IT understands that we're there to help. We're not there to tell them they've done things wrong. In fact, most of the time they do a great job on whatever it is that they're doing. But we can help to improve those practices by paying a little bit more attention to the data, and that will help everybody achieve better business values, which, you know, will keep us in business and allow us to complete the missions. Works the same way in the public sector too, by the way. Lots of government examples that we've worked with over the years.
Love it. Love the interruption. We know we're live.
Yeah, well, we know, Len.
So, next question is, what is the best way to apply change management strategies to data governance programs?
So there's no book on that I'm aware of, but there are plenty of good books on change management. I'm trying to think, a woman named Marilyn Anderson, I think, has written a really good book on change management. There are lots and lots of them. And this is why I say we are an immature discipline, but it's not okay for us to remain immature. And I'm absolutely certain that over the next couple of these data governance conference events, we'll start to see people that are saying, okay, we need to dive into change management and find out what those specific links are. Now, again, your change management people will absolutely be thrilled that you've come and asked them questions. So, can you involve us in a communication plan? Can you get us involved in organizational change management? Can you help us to win hearts and minds in this battle for the soul of the company's data around this? But I don't know any specific guidance that has been done yet to do that. So maybe the questioner would actually be willing to make a presentation around that.
I love it. It's a great topic for a presentation. So speaking of CDO, I'm interested in your thoughts on CIO versus CTO versus CDO. I find that many CIOs are really CTOs.
Ooh, that sounds like one of my lines. Yes. again, we want to be careful and not insult these people. And I have to thank my wife on this one because she reads all my books before I send them out and catches all the stupid things I say in the books that hopefully go out before they go out in the marketplace. And as I said, about half of the CIOs say, no, my title is CIO and I'm responsible for data. We don't need no darn stupid data officer around here. On the other hand, about half of them say, yeah, I could use some help with that, and I'd be glad to come be part of the team. One of the presentations, I think this was at one of the previous data governance conferences, we have a group in the federal government that has a really good example of this. It was a chief data officer who originally the CIO was very hostile to the concept of having somebody in charge of the data separate from the IT systems. So it does make a lot of sense that CIO really might want to stand for Chief Integration Officer or Information Technology Officer or something along those lines, but that they're really not responsible for data as an asset and its use organization-wide. And that's what we've really got to come around. CIOs have enormous portfolios. And if we want them to do more with data, they're probably going to have to give up a little bit of some other things. And I don't know many organizations where the CIOs have a lot of spare cycles, staff resources, et cetera, in order to do this. So I do agree that names are important. If we had to do it over again, we would probably label the CIO function a function that is responsible for making sure the machinery works the way it's supposed to, and that another person would realize that the data that feeds into those machines, and this is why the oil analogy is so alluring. Again, it's incorrect, but still it's a very powerful motivator, where people say, you know, the quality of the data going in is a very different process from making sure machines work. Again, I've already spoken to the difference in rhythm and cadence and things like that that they have in order to do these things. It's just a very, very different process. So it is important that we sort this out. We haven't got it all sorted out, but I will say that Gartner has told us that by year 2020, virtually all organizations will have a chief data officer of one form or another, and that will enable them to do, hopefully, some better work around the data space.
So, you know, back to talking about IT, you know, we have a data governance program in place, and now the IT organization wants to put their own in place as well. Do you see a problem when there are more than one data governance programs in place in a company?
Well, that depends on how well they get along and how well they talk. I have seen where those types of organizational structures end up working at cross purposes. So it's going to depend. What you're asking there is a question that is kind of like the question I get occasionally, well, should we manage our data separate from information? And yes, it can be done. I've seen it done maybe 3 times in 30 years well. But on the other hand, what we're really looking for is, can we have these organizations work in harmony together? And in some organizations, the answer is absolutely yes. In other organizations, they may have different goals and objectives that are not coordinated at a high level, and you could imagine that that probably isn't going to produce optimal results. Again, it's possible to do it, but just like trying to manage data separately from information, I think the consequences of trying to do that purposefully incur a cost to the organization, and that it ends up having fewer benefits than most people would desire.
All righty. And so, you know, if data governance has greater success driven by the business, should it report to business organizations, CEO, COO, CFO, rather than IT, or a strategic team in between?
We're seeing most success with a strategic team in between. We are saying that the CDO should be reporting to the business, although only about a third are. About a third of the CDOs are reporting directly to the CEO. A third of the CDOs are reporting directly to IT, and a third of them are reporting to those other XO concepts that you just described, the teams that are out there. Again, people who are chief financial officers, chief marketing officers are the typical starting places for those. So we're going to have a neat experiment over the next couple of years, and we can look and see which one works best. in my mind, it's important that data governance not be seen as an IT function by the rest of the organization, because it's too easy for people to just say, that's computer stuff, and turn it out. You know, I need computers to do my business, but they don't really actually help me with my business other than making sure my email gets delivered and things like that. And again, I'm oversimplifying here greatly in order to do that. So my preference is to make sure that the CDO reports to the business, but that the team that does the data governance, very hard to do that work without having IT support. Remember my statement earlier, the language of data governance is metadata. If you can't access the metadata, and that's going to be an IT function, it's going to be very difficult for you to have meaningful conversations and point to meaningful progress as a data governance organization.
All righty. Well, those are all the questions that have come in thus far. Just a reminder that I will send a follow-up email by end of day Thursday with links to the slides and links to the recording. I'll give anybody a couple of minutes or a second here to add anything else. If there's anything else you want to add, as Peter's showing there, our next webinar is in July, monetizing data management. Show me the money. I love that topic. July 12th. And I think that's it. Peter, anything else you want to add before we wrap it up?
Nope, I'm going to dive back into the 550 people that are out here and start soaking up some more on this really exciting topic. So thank you, everybody, for your time. Thank you, Shannon, and we'll see you guys next month.
Well, thank you, Peter. Appreciate it. As always, another great presentation. And thanks to our attendees for being so engaged in everything we do and asking such great questions today. And so we will hopefully see you next month, and I hope everyone has a great day. Cheers.
Cheers.